I'm doing.
All right. I think it's time to get started. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm going to put the PowerPoint. We've got a slideshow that will be running in the background as the speakers talk. And I wanted to welcome everybody to this next in one of a mini series of forums that the League of Women Voters of Alabama has been holding to help educate everyone, ourselves and voters, on issues that are affecting all of us in Alabama, because we feel like to have access to accurate information it helps us to be able to advocate better for change in Alabama. And it also, we want to help really shine a light on how the people that you elect to represent you affect the issues that you care about. And that is true at the local, municipal, and county levels, as well as the state and federal levels. And so your voice will make a big difference in almost every topic that affects you when the government's involved, and your vote is needed more than ever. Last week, we had another healthcare related forum, and that was entitled Healthcare in Alabama, Your Vote Can Make a Difference. And tonight, we're continuing the focus on healthcare with a program entitled Reproductive Health in Alabama, the Legal Landscape. And we've got 3 amazing speakers and also our moderator. And we've got just basically a really fantastic lineup, and I'm going to hand it off to the moderator here in just a moment. I do want to say that we are live streaming it to YouTube, and if you can see the over on the side of LWVAL is the YouTube. If you're searching for us on YouTube, that's how you find us. You can go to the recording of tonight's forum by going to the LWVAL YouTube channel. You click on playlist, and you can see that there is a healthcare and Medicaid expansion playlist. And when you click on that, you'll see last week and this week's forums, and you can watch it, you can share it. We hope you share it, because the more we get people to pay attention to this topic, the better. It'll make a lot bigger difference when we're trying to get our politicians to listen to us. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to our moderator, Attorney Margaret Pace of Baldwin County Local League. She is a League of Women Voters member from Baldwin County. And I'm going to hand it off right now, and just 1 second. All right.
Hi, everyone. Like Kathy said, my name's Margaret Pace, and I'm an attorney down in Baldwin County. I just wanted to thank everyone for attending tonight's forum and CLE about Alabama's current reproductive laws. And before I turn over the screen to our incredible panel, I just wanted to thank each and every one of you for listening and even having the willingness to learn. We don't know what the future holds, but it certainly begins with figuring out what our current situation is. And I know everyone's heard a lot about Roe and Dobbs and how it's changed our nation, but I'm excited to learn how it's changed us in our home state of Alabama. Adrienne Frazior will be speaking shortly, and she's a shareholder with the Polsinelli law firm, and she provides guidance to healthcare providers nationwide. And then after Adrienne speaks, Tish Gotell Faulks is the legal director at the ACLU of Alabama. And finally, Stephen Stetson will join us, and he's the executive director of Planned Parenthood Alabama. And if everyone could please gather your questions during their presentations. Only after all the presentations have been completed, we're going to have time for you to submit your questions via Zoom, or you can text them in the chat box, and we'll get them. So again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. If we can pull up the slides. Great. As Margaret said, my name is Adrienne Frazier. I'm a criminal healthcare lawyer here in Dallas, Texas. I'm at the firm Polsinelli, which is just a large nationwide firm that has a large concentration of healthcare lawyers. In my previous life, I was a prosecutor with the Department of Justice for 10 years, prosecuting healthcare fraud. It's kind of where the criminal and the healthcare comes together. And then prior to that, I was a state court prosecutor in Texas, prosecuting state level crimes, violent crimes, and public integrity crimes and that sort of thing. Because I am a lawyer, I do have to give a little disclaimer, just that nothing I'm saying today should constitute legal advice. And all opinions are my own, although I am in my Polsinelli office, and Polsinelli supports the education in this area, as I've spent about 75% of my time researching and lecturing on DOBS since the opinion came out, but the opinions I express today are my own. So let's just start real quickly, just to level set where we're at. So Dobbs v. Jackson was, Jackson Women's Health was ruled on by the United States Supreme Court on June 24th, 2022. And essentially it held that there was no federal constitutional right to abortion, and it returned the matter to the states to regulate individually. So states now are free to pass varying abortion bans. Some states, like where I'm at in Texas, and also in Alabama as well, had laws already on the books that became effective almost immediately upon the reversal of Roe, kind of in anticipation, as many states were thinking, hoping that Roe would be overturned, and eventually it was. We have the next slide. Unfortunately, this has created a lot of confusion because the state laws are very different. So you can't really pay attention to national news and understand what's going on in your state because it is so focused on each individual state. So the Human Life Protection Act was passed in Alabama in 2019. As I mentioned, it was in anticipation of Roe being overruled. And it states, I'm just going to paraphrase this for you. The entire statute is here for you, directly taken from the code. So if you want to read it, essentially all abortions are banned in Alabama except to save the life of the mother. And that requires a serious health risk to the unborn child's mother. And then you have to have the physician has to have a second opinion in order to document that the abortion was performed actually to save the life of the mother. We can go to the next slide. So what constitutes abortion? Because really, when you delve into these issues, you're going to find that what you thought was true maybe isn't as true as you thought. You've really got to look at the law and understand exactly what it means. And so when we go to what abortion means, it's defined specifically in the statute. It says the use of or prescription of any instrument, medicine, drug, or any other substance or device with the intent to terminate the pregnancy of a woman known to be pregnant with knowledge of the termination by those means will with reasonable likelihood cause the death of the unborn child. And essentially, I put this in here to make it clear that this abortion ban is for prescription drugs that create an abortion and also the actual physical medical procedure. We can go to the next slide. So the penalties for violating this law, they're stiff in Alabama as they are in many states. An abortion performed in violation of the chapter of the Human Life Protection Act is a Class A felony, and the penalty is life or not more than 99 years or less than 10 years. We call that 10 to life. So the minimum would be 10 years, the maximum would be life in prison or 99 years. In an attempt to perform an abortion in violation of the Human Life Protection Act is a Class C felony, and the penalty for that is not more than 10 years or less than 1 year and a day. We can go to the next slide. There we go. And I'm actually going to advance a little bit on this other screen over here because some of mine's getting cut off. So essentially, when the states had the right to control abortion returned to them, a lot of stuff happened at the federal level. Not much really could be done, given that there's no constitutional right, according to our Supreme Court, any longer to have an abortion. But the president came out, he issued executive orders. Merrick Garland, our attorney general, came out kind of in an effort to help people understand the federal laws that are going to have an overlay on top of the state laws, and really just to offer assistance to people who are struggling with this, and to let them know that there are federal rights that they are entitled to. So I'm just going to read this to you, and then we'll just talk about what it does. So in this executive order on August 3rd, 2022, about a month and a half after the decision came out, it says, as it remains the policy of my administration to support women's access to reproductive health care services, including their ability to travel to seek abortion care in states where it is legal, I am directing my administration to take further action to protect access to reproductive health care services and to address the crisis facing women's health and public health more broadly. And then it's a specific directive to the Secretary of HHS to consider actions to advance the reproductive health care services, including expanding Medicaid and assisting with travel, because that's the issue now, right? Some states have the ability to provide abortions, but the issue is travel. And it's not just the economical issue of travel. Can people afford to go to another state? It's also that some states are seeking to penalize that. Now, Alabama, as far as I can tell so far, has not gone so far as to say that travel will be prosecuted. I was doing a little bit of research on that recently, but other states like my own, Texas, have. They're going to work to prosecute people who are seeking to travel to obtain an abortion. Next slide. And so coming back to Attorney General Garland, in his statement, right after the decision was announced, he stated, we recognize that traveling to obtain reproductive care may not be feasible in many circumstances. Again, that's the economic issue. But under bedrock constitutional principles, women who reside in states that have banned access to comprehensive reproductive care must remain free to seek that care in states where it is legal. Moreover, under fundamental First Amendment principles, individuals must remain free to inform and counsel each other about the reproductive care that is available in other states. Essentially, what he is saying is we have a right to travel and we have a right to talk about this. It's kind of strange to think in America in this day and age that we really are considering those two issues, whether we have a right to travel to another state to get something that we feel we need, or whether we have the ability to talk about it. And so it was important for the Attorney General to come back out and say, yes, these two things we have constitutional rights to. They're not taken away by this, no matter what might be happening in individual states. And then the next thing, if we can go to the next slide.
I'm going to take this off of screen show because I'm having trouble advancing the slides.
Okay.
Just one second. All right, let me share it again.
Okay. Did you say you're going to share it again?
I am going to share it again. I'm just having to take it off a slideshow because it's my mouse is given me a headache.
Well, I can go ahead and continue while you're working on that. The most probably precedential statement that's come out about this in terms of, what we might be able to use in the future to guarantee the access and the rights that we know we already have is the concurrence of Brett Kavanaugh in the Dobbs case. And that is where he addressed specifically the right to interstate travel. So he said some other abortion-related legal questions raised by today's decision are not especially difficult as a constitutional matter. For example, may a state bar a resident of that state from traveling to another state to obtain an abortion? In my view, the answer is no, based on the constitutional right to interstate travel. Again, trying to come back and say, it's not as grave as it seems like it is. We do still have a right to interstate travel. That's not to stop different legislators from trying to legislate around that and trying to make it harder for people to travel and trying to make it difficult for people to
and prior to that, I was a state court prosecutor in Texas, prosecuting eventually.
I'm so sorry. I couldn't hear that.
I am sorry. I was trying to get back on track and I was trying to figure out which slide I was on. Sorry.
No problem. So essentially, we are seeing that in Texas, that our legislators are trying to figure out ways to keep people from being able to travel. Now, one way to do that is to the overlay of aiding and abetting laws and penalizing someone for aiding a woman in obtaining an abortion. There is kind of a nuance in the law there, because in Alabama, the woman cannot be prosecuted for obtaining an abortion. It is an exception to the statute. We'll go through that in just a moment. But that just goes to show the complexity of the laws and how confusing they are, that we really can't say how certain things are going to be prosecuted just yet. And then if we can start with the next one, is anatomy of a criminal case. So if you have not been through the criminal system before, or you're not a criminal lawyer, you may not understand exactly what that looks like. In a circumstance where a physician was prosecuted, or a nurse or a hospital attendee or anybody like that who assisted in delivering or providing reproductive care and giving an abortion to a woman, those individuals could be prosecuted. And that just means essentially they'd be arrested. They'd have to go before a judge. They'd have to plead their case to the judge. They'd eventually have to have a trial and have a jury or a judge decide what their fate is going to be, essentially. And then on top of that, they are then going to be sentenced. And the sentence, as we mentioned a moment ago, is up to life in prison. So it's a pretty severe thing, even to be charged in a criminal case. It's not just the threat of that life in prison. It's even charging in some circumstances can have a real chilling effect on medical care, and also on licenses and things like that individuals have to have in order just to do their jobs. So let's talk about who can be prosecuted. That's the next slide. As I mentioned, anybody associated with performing the actual abortion, or attempting to perform the abortion. So that would be physicians, nurses, hospital staff, and then those who aid and abet, family members, friends who provide rides to somebody to get an abortion, who set up appointments, any of that kind of stuff. Now, we're talking about specifically within the state of Alabama, but we also discussed a moment ago whether or not that travel to another state could also be penalized. And I think the question is kind of, we just need to wait and see a little bit as to how far the lawmakers and the prosecutors want to go with this stuff. But specific to Alabama, the person seeking the abortion cannot be prosecuted, and a physician giving a second opinion that an abortion is being performed to save the life of the mother also would not be prosecuted. That is, if there is any bright spot in any of this, that is at least helpful, because it will allow physicians to obtain second opinions in order to justify the actions that they're taking, without that other person also being concerned that they're going to be prosecuted as well. But it's still pretty extreme. And then the next slide, please. So in talking about who can prosecute one of these cases, these are, as I mentioned, they're state court cases, they're criminal cases, so it's going to be your local district attorney. Some of the district attorneys in Alabama have made statements about whether they will or will not prosecute. And I think it was shortly after or right before Dobbs, there was a long list of district attorneys that signed a letter saying we're not prosecuting, mostly in more urban areas. Jefferson County DA Danny Carr stated that he would not prosecute. He signed that letter. Others have not, though, and it's a little difficult for them because if they're facing re-election, or if they're concerned that the attorney general is going to swoop in and prosecute these cases for them. But these are just some that I found, and I would encourage you, if there's a DA up for re-election in your county, to search what their position has been on these abortion laws to give you an understanding as to whether or not they intend to prosecute. So Tuscaloosa County DA Hayes Webbs said, "We will go where the facts and the law take us." That's a little hard to interpret. I think you have to read a little bit more into it. Prosecutors do have wide discretion in what they will prosecute, and they also do take an oath to follow the law. So I think that's what he's saying. We're going to look at each individual case. And then Mobile County DA candidate Moshe Donald said, "I will use prosecutorial discretion to enforce the laws in ways that make sense, promote justice and safety, and make the best use of financial and personal resources." Again, that's kind of a not really going to say what I'm going to do, but at least she's addressing it, I suppose. And so, like I said, it's just important to know what the candidate's position is on that, if that is an issue that's important to you. And if we can go to the next slide. Even if the district attorney has decided that they will not prosecute these cases, even if they don't make a statement about it, but you're just not seeing those prosecutions happening in their counties, and there are cases that could be prosecuted, I suppose, the Alabama Attorney General has the authority to step in. And so this is a statement from his office. It says that under Alabama law, the Attorney General has the authority to assume prosecution of any criminal case within the state of Alabama. Should a district attorney refuse to enforce Alabama law, the Attorney General may step in to prosecute the case. So it's not much comfort if you are, it's not much comfort to take the statement of the district attorney, because the Alabama Attorney General can always come in and prosecute if they choose to. So just a factor to be thinking about, I think. And in other states, it's a little bit different. Like here in Texas, for instance, our Attorney General cannot come in and prosecute. So it is the statement of the local district attorney is what's going to stand, but that's just not the case in Alabama. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tish. I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have as we get to the end of this.
Thank you, Adrienne. The impact of Dobbs here in Alabama.
Hold on one sec, Tish. I've got to
Which?
find. I gotta. All right. All right, now I'm back. Sorry.
Right. And there I am. Sorry, next slide, please. My little guy is watching TV and he's got on headphones. So part of my objective here is to talk to you about reproductive health in Alabama generally, with the special concerns that come about because of Dobbs v. Jackson Health. And in the state of Alabama, we are in the interesting position of having both the challenges of living in rural areas and simultaneously the challenges of living in urbanized areas. The entire state of Alabama is in a public health crisis, and the outcome of Dobbs has aggravated that crisis to a great extent. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the tale of two challenges in Alabama, we have to understand how the process of giving birth to the process of carrying a pregnancy carries a great deal of risk, especially in Alabama. 1 in 3 women living in a metropolitan or urban area lives in an OB desert. That means that that person does not have easy or convenient access to a medical professional skilled in evaluating a person through the stages of pregnancy. And of course, for many people who become pregnant, their OB may also be their gynecologist. And so we also know that those regular health checks are not occurring. And we are making the availability of those medical professionals even more challenging by imposing the risk, the exposure to criminal liability, if a patient is pregnant when they arrive for services and they are not pregnant, or that pregnancy is not viable when they leave. And please understand that this doesn't just impact the OBGYN. It impacts any medical professional working with any type of practice that may lead to a complication within the pregnancy. In the United States nationally, the cost for a vaginal birth is about $13,000. Here in Alabama, it's slightly higher at about 15,000. And that is assuming a traditional vaginal birth. The C-section is more expensive. It is more complicated. There are more concerns, and usually a person who is delivering by C-section may also have other complications in their pregnancy. Looking at the rural areas, as anyone in Alabama knows, we have suffered the loss of our rural hospitals, healthcare clinics, and the services that one would typically have when they are experiencing an unexpected or even an expected pregnancy. 50% of rural counties have no hospitalized obstetrical services. And that is especially concerning here in Alabama, where we have one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the country. Our infant mortality rates are also impacted by this. And the abortion ban does nothing to improve the safety of carrying a pregnancy here in Alabama. In fact, it complicates it by bringing more criminals to the termination of a pregnancy or the unexpected end of a pregnancy, as compared to what a person should receive in the event of an unexpected termination or a purposeful termination of a pregnancy. And that is sensitivity, comfort, and support. Next slide, please. As far as Dobbs and its impact here in Alabama, first and foremost, as Adrienne mentioned, the Supreme Court of the United States determined that our legislature should make the decision about whether or not women deserve the full protection of their privacy and their relationship with their medical professional. In fact, on June 24th, when the Dobbs opinion came down, Alabama began enforcing its total abortion ban. They also went immediately to court to have the injunction lifted that had previously prohibited the enforcement of that act. For the ACLU of Alabama, that was especially difficult because in Alabama, ACLU of Alabama was the primary party fighting the legal fight to protect a woman's right to choose. Without the support and underpinning of Roe versus Wade, we had no legal recourse to continue to fight against the abortion ban as it stood. And so on that day, we had no choice but to agree to the lifting of the injunction and the voluntary dismissal of our cause of action. What others not realize is that we also had a case on appeal before the 11th Circuit, in which we were working to ensure that minors who found themselves in a situation in which they sought to terminate their pregnancy could do so with a judicial bypass. Several weeks after Dobbs, we also voluntarily dismissed that appeal, thus clearing the way for a return to a situation in which minors who become pregnant are faced with the question of what do they do now, especially now that they not only don't have any access to the judicial bypass, but even if they could get the judicial bypass, they have no method by which they can secure an abortion within their home territory. And then finally, we have to keep in mind, looking at this so closely and not really seeing it, that we acknowledge, there we go, that we acknowledge that here in Alabama, on the question of whether we can legislate in the state to support access to abortion. The Alabama Constitution declares that the state acknowledges, declares, and affirms that it is the public policy of this state to recognize and support the sanctity of unborn life and the rights of unborn children, including the right to life. In fact, I would propose here that the state of Alabama has put the rights and interests of the unborn before the rights and interests of those who are currently living. As evidenced by what Adrienne pointed out to you, the focus on the child's mom rather than the health and welfare of the pregnant person. That type of distinction is critical here as we think through constitutional rights and interests. Next slide, please. So the question comes to us, what do we do now? And at the ACLU of Alabama, I find myself in the complicated position of being a litigator looking for the fight. But the fight is no longer left to litigation spaces. First, to reduce harm now, we have to improve the reproductive health providers. And we need to do this in Alabama, not only because of the outcome of Dobbs, but because it is a critical failure of our state to fail to provide health care for its pregnant people. We need to expand the options of care. As I stated earlier, in many jurisdictions, it is not easy to find an OB or a gynecologist, and thus we have to turn to modernized methods by which we can expand and increase access to health care, access to pre-birth support and attention, and access to the things that are more likely to reduce the likelihood of unwanted and unexpected pregnancies. Several of the ways that we can do that include expanding the right of access to telehealth and other services that can reach rural areas. The Federal Office of Rural Health Policy created a program called the Rural Maternity and Obstetrics Management Strategies Grant. That grant, accessible to healthcare providers in rural areas, provides funding that supports and assists in expanding access to healthcare in the rural areas of our country. And in fact, so far, 6 groups in Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, New Mexico, Texas, and West Virginia have received $21 million in funding to support and assist in expanding healthcare in rural areas. I would also suggest if you're in Alabama, we would need to look for opportunities for midwives, for doulas, and for other people who are skilled at supporting and assisting people who become pregnant. But what we cannot continue to do is pretend that abortion is not healthcare. The simple fact is that a person who becomes pregnant in Alabama has specialized needs, and the legislature cannot know what all of those needs are. They need to step back. As we push the legislature, we are asking them to prioritize reproductive health resources, including access to abortion, and we need to ensure that they reestablish the medical economy and equality for people who become pregnant in Alabama. The call to action, in my view, is to amplify a narrative to reduce harm. That means that we are supporting expansive options for medical autonomy and reproductive choice. That means that we are expanding access to health care and the many barriers that prevent better health outcomes here in Alabama, which includes expanding access to Medicaid. It includes extending access to Medicaid for people who have recently given birth. It includes extending Medicaid services to women before they give birth, as soon as they discover that they are pregnant. But most critically, it requires that the legislature step out of a woman's decision-making process and leave those questions to that person and their medical team. In Alabama, the ambiguity in whether one can be charged for conspiracy, for discussing, financing, or assisting someone in ambiguity of whether it would constitute aiding and abetting if a person were to support, assist, finance, drive a person to terminate a pregnancy in a jurisdiction where it is legal, is working to the advantage of fear and lack of knowledge. It is incumbent upon us to educate the people of Alabama, to educate people who become pregnant about the many complications that are not life-threatening, but can be life-threatening to a person who has become pregnant. This is not a simple process. This is a medical situation that requires expert opinion, support, and service. And the state of Alabama was failing people who become pregnant. They have complicated and made it more detrimental now. Next slide, please. As I said, what comes next is really out of the hands of the litigators. Our first best approach is to deal with the legislature here in Alabama, to call them and tell them what is needed, to call them and tell them about the concerns that women no longer have fair and equal opportunity to have a private, confidential conversation with their medical professional, and to insist that people who have the expertise and the information push forward. Next slide, please. Kathy, I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Tish. Make it get back on track here. I want to change views. There he is.
Hello. You ready for me, Kathy?
I am. Let me throw the slides back up there. Have trouble seeing and actually spotlighting. So I guess that's, now I'm back.
Well, let me start by thanking everybody for being here. I'm honored for the invitation to speak tonight. And thanks to the other panelists, Tish and Adrienne. That was awesome stuff. I really appreciate y'all sharing that knowledge with us. And overall, thanks to the League as well. I hope everybody on this call is a member of the League of Women Voters. I am a former board member and really appreciate the nonpartisan and studious approach that the League brings to the public policy issues confronting us in Alabama. So really appreciate the League for lifting this and the previous healthcare topic up. These are the issues that define who we are as Alabamians. So yeah, I'm Stephen Stetson. I am a I'm the state director of Planned Parenthood here in Alabama. I'm based in Montgomery. I use he, him pronouns, and super excited to get a chance to rap with y'all a little bit tonight. So first slide, please. So I'm sort of a history guy by my background, journalist by training, but I love history, and I thought I would zoom the lens back a little bit and just set the table a little bit as far as our organization. That's a picture of Margaret Sanger, who was a founder of the organizations that evolved into what we know as Planned Parenthood. So we've been around for over 100 years. It's important, I think, to note as a disclaimer, we are doing a lot of work as an organization to note that for over a century, Planned Parenthood had basically celebrated Margaret Sanger and her legacy as one of the founders of the modern birth control movement. But the failure there by Planned Parenthood was to fail to denounce the eugenic beliefs that she held and the way that those beliefs hurt generations of people of color, people with disabilities. And I always want to mention, whenever I mention Sanger, that the silence carried on that legacy. And although we acknowledge it, it doesn't erase how the elements of the movement for reproductive freedom did improve the lives of a lot of people who can become pregnant by giving them control of their body and their lives. But we just live in a world where both legacies are true. And as somebody who's from Alabama, I always want to acknowledge that sort of tricky and complicated and hopefully nuanced background. But the other reason why I start with the historical perspective is because I am really proud that Planned Parenthood has been in Alabama since the 1930s. A group of doctors in the Birmingham area were interested in providing reproductive health care to people. And we have the oldest organization of our kind in the entire Southeast. So, you know, take that, Georgia, take that, North Carolina. Alabama was on the scene first, trying to do good in the world with good progressive healthcare. Now, it wasn't perfect, but we're not just making this up as we go. We have been around for a long time. And so I'll just say, by way of table setting here, that Planned Parenthood in Alabama is part of a structure called Planned Parenthood Southeast. We call our Alabama group an affiliate. We're one of 3 states in the Southeastern affiliate. So if you are looking for us online and you find Planned Parenthood Southeast, it's us, Georgia, and Mississippi. Now, the reason why I partly mention that is just to explain our structure. And you've got the big national entity that everybody knows, the name brand recognition and the pink t-shirts and all that stuff. But also to let you know that these are really significant times in the South, because you may have seen that the Supreme Court case that we've been talking about all night came out of Mississippi, and that Georgia is one of the most pivotal political states in the entire nation. So here in Alabama, we're sandwiched between 2 really significant states, and we're trying to both learn from and influence our neighbors. So the other thing I wanted to lift up about our structure is that we don't really have local leagues, like the League of Women Voters has local leagues. But what we have as a statewide organization is we have members from the Shoals all the way down to Mobile, from Auburn all the way over to Tuscaloosa. So we have a comprehensive and robust membership group. I hope that you will consider being part of that if you're not. But I mentioned that to lift up to some of the most exciting work that we're doing, which is organizing on college campuses. We have groups that are called Generation Action Groups on college campuses. I was in Auburn earlier this week giving a presentation to our Auburn Gen Action chapter. And if you can't get fired up by the energy of young people, then you're doing this wrong, because these are people who are fully engaged. They're not apathetic or beat down or sensing futility about the situation. They are open, candid, energetic, handing out birth control, educating their peers. And so if you yourself are in college or know someone in a campus group that would like to get a chapter started, we've already got a group in Tuscaloosa at the University of Alabama, one in Birmingham at UAB, one in Auburn. Birmingham Southern, kind of a question mark at the moment, if I'm just being honest. And we're trying to expand to some more HBCUs as well. There's a possible group starting up at Alabama A&M. If you know anybody at Alabama State or anywhere, we are looking to help grow the next generation of this movement. So looking backwards, looking forwards, and I'll take us to the next slide. So the Alabama landscape here, what you're looking at is a photo of a new multi-million-dollar facility that we just built in Birmingham, opened it in the middle of COVID. This is a state-of-the-art, cutting-edge medical center that we have in Birmingham downtown. And just to kind of further set the table a little bit, it's one of what were 5 abortion clinics in the state of Alabama before the Dobbs decision. There was ours in Birmingham, which you're looking at. There was a clinic of ours down in Mobile, so we had 2. And then there was Huntsville, Tuscaloosa, and Montgomery. So y'all may have been familiar with some of those other places. None of those places are performing abortion care anymore for all the obvious reasons that you just heard, but each of those entities is kind of doing their own thing. So one of the messages I'd like to leave y'all with is that we're still open for business. You know, Birmingham and Mobile are still open, not providing abortion care, but providing a whole suite of other kinds of healthcare services for people. And we're continuing to see a high demand at our healthcare centers. But I want to sort of build on what Tish was just talking about. And since we are a healthcare provider, contextualize what we're doing in the framework of the landscape in Alabama. And let me start the lens at a macro level and say that we're facing a healthcare crisis across the board, not just on reproductive issues, but we're talking about US healthcare spending at like 20% of the nation's GDP. The entire GDP, 20% healthcare. And we're spending more on healthcare than almost any of the other high income nations. And we're getting worse healthcare outcomes from it. So you don't have to be partisan on either side of the fence to say we're kind of getting ripped off. It's a raw deal to be spending the most and be getting some of the worst outcomes. And those figures are all just going to grow. We're going to grow like 5% on healthcare spending annually to like something like $7 trillion annually by 2030. And that's what the Center for Medicare and Medicaid is projecting. So we're looking at a world where we are spending an astronomical amount of money on healthcare, and yet we're getting these sort of miserable outcomes. So Tish already touched on this, but let me just hammer home that we've got a physician shortage. We've got high rates of infant and maternal mortality. We've got cervical cancer mortality. We're leading the country in a lot of these categories. You know, I used to sum it up for my friends from other places. I said, you know, we're first in everything bad and last in everything good. And this is going to be more of that. Highest rates of cervical cancer mortality in the nation with like 100 deaths every year. And let's be clear that Black women are dying at twice the rate of white women. And so these are cutting across racial disparities. Our infant mortality is number 5 in the nation. We're 13th in maternal mortality rate, with Black women dying at a higher rate than white women. We're 9th highest teen birth rate. And let me give you one that kind of hits home for me. I'm from Alabama, and when I was growing up in rural Pike County, a little town called Banks, just outside of Troy, Alabama, you know, Banks didn't have a hospital, and Troy still does have a hospital. But if you've driven through some of these small towns, a lot of those places don't have hospitals anymore. So in 1980, 45 of our rural counties, there's 54 counties that count as rural, 45 of them had hospitals providing obstetricians and those kinds of services. And today, that number went from 45 in 1980 down to 16. So we are experiencing a crisis as care is contracting, and those things are independent of the immediate subject for the night, but they are the context in which our healthcare system is beginning to break down. And let me give you one more specific sort of stat about that, which is more than half of the people in Alabama that were seeking abortion care were on Medicaid. And a lot of those people already had one child. So these are not people that were just unable to deal with the consequences of their actions or, you know, the sort of right-wing talking points. But these are people who had already made the decision to bring a child into the world and just said, I can't have another one. So a lot of those people were already mothers. And let me say one other thing here about the landscape in Alabama, and that's to build on the sort of political sentiment that was already expressed by Adrienne and Tish. And that we know for a fact that Steve Marshall, our Attorney General, has said that in a world where the Biden administration is going to take some of those steps like Adrienne was talking about, Steve Marshall has already said that if they try to offer any kind of abortion care at the Veterans Administration facilities, that he intends to prosecute those. And so I think we are dealing with a political climate in which opportunistic Attorney General folks in his office, the Attorney General himself and the state attorneys under him, or politically ambitious DAs are going to seek those kinds of opportunities if they can find them, even if they lose, to politically grandstand on the issue. So that's my little bit of political prognostication for the evening. Next slide, please. So I just threw this in as a screenshot of my computer from an article I read in the New York Times yesterday, and I just recommend that y'all go find it. You can see the URL up there if you get the slides afterwards, or just search the New York Times. And this is a compelling story that I think offers a spotlight into what we're experiencing, not just, I mean, the article's about West Virginia and some other rural states, but it's happening in Alabama, and we're experiencing it across the board. As far as rural healthcare coverage, the impact of COVID is absolutely astronomical on the provision of healthcare. And I would also say that individual healthcare centers are experiencing this, not just due to the pressures, the financial pressures, et cetera, and the social stigma of being the kinds of doctors who are willing to provide abortion care, but there's also this sort of cascading effect. And so I just want to really underscore that these, at the end of the day, is about humans and other humans providing services to one another. So I recommend that article if you want to check it out. Next slide. So I'm going to sort of just do a little more forecasting here. What you see there is a picture of the Alabama legislature. On the other side, the aforementioned Generation Action college student activists that were doing some incredible tabling at the Central Alabama Pride Parade this past summer in June. So we've got sort of the rock solid obstructionist set in their ways Alabama legislature, and the high powered energy of people power and young people especially, but across the board. So I think what we are going to see as we're looking forward to where this is going is, number one, the unbelievable power of working in coalition. A lot of these groups need to be working together. We sit at a table with a number of other groups that are doing reproductive justice and advocacy work, including Tish's organization, the Alabama ACLU, everyone ranging from, there's a great organization called URGE, and I'm afraid to kind of start listing organizations for fear of leaving someone out, but I want you to know that the landscape is well populated with other groups. From AIDS Alabama, the Yellowhammer Fund is the nonprofit that works out of the Tuscaloosa Clinic, the Human Rights Campaign, the Black Women's Roundtable, and a lot of these groups are sitting in regular meetings in coalition with one another, trying to figure out how to best amplify and sort of bring our power to bear on the institutional structures. And I'm not going to leave that topic without saying there are also some winnable races out there. You know, election season's coming up, and the general vibe in Alabama is, oh, well, nobody's running and we can't do anything and it's all futile. But I'm not going to get partisan here and respect the league's views on that. But I will say there are a number of races where the incumbents may be vulnerable, or that the seats may be more winnable than you would think. And so I would encourage you all to crunch the numbers. And I have personally been contacted by some of those folks looking for volunteers, and they are hungry for people who will do the old school stuff of door knocking, phone banking, envelope stuffing. And so you might be surprised as to I'm not saying we can flip the composition of any particular legislative entity, but in individual races, there are several out there that may not be getting the same sort of statewide recognition. So it's not getting media coverage, but if you take a look, now would be a good time to get involved because the election is coming up. A few other things that I think are movable here as far as like just levers that we can turn. And that's on the issue, you know, Tish mentioned public opinion. And I would say that as far as messaging, the question of compulsory pregnancy is really a favorable message frame, that people do not like the idea of being compelled to bring a birth to term, especially in cases of rape and incest, which, as Adrienne mentioned, we have no exemptions for. If you talk about it as a burden or something that it's freedom from government imposition of compulsory pregnancy, I think that frame has tested well, and it is the way that we ought to be talking about this, because these are people that are going to be compelled now to bring lives into the world that they do not want. And I also think that something Tish really hammered home has tested well in what we've seen, which is that the legislature is not qualified to make these decisions. If you look at for example, lawmaker who sponsored the Texas-style bill in the last session that would have allowed vigilante enforcement of the abortion laws, similar to what Texas had passed before the Dobbs decision, that person's job is to rent lawn equipment to people. The idea that decisions are being outsourced to people whose job it is to know about good lawnmowers is preposterous. And I think we need to elevate the overall suspicion of government in the sense that these are not the people who need to be making decisions about what we do with our bodies. Leave that up to patients and their doctors. And I do think that there's one other sort of interesting issue that fluttered to the surface in this last week, which is the question of whether there is going to be an attempt at a federal ban on abortions. You may have seen Senator Lindsey Graham had proposed something in Congress that would have done a complete 180 on the previous messaging, which was that abortion ought to be left up to the states, and said no, in fact, it's the federal question. And there was a proposed federal ban. It didn't go anywhere, in part because of the abrupt nature of that reversal. But I would encourage everybody to keep your eye on Congress, and the composition of Congress is going to be really important there. A few other little things I want to lift up before I stop, and that is that you can possibly anticipate some more action at the legislature, whether or not they come and to add exemptions for rape and incest in the coming session, which starts in the spring. I think you can see some of these folks that have their eyes on things like in vitro fertilization. You may see there being legal debates about pills and emergency contraception, and a world in which the FDA has already approved this medication. What would it mean legally for the state to forbid something that the FDA is safe? I think there's a fertile area for sort of legal challenges there. And then two other sort of parentheticals, I would say, are we're going to continue to keep our foot on the gas as regards sex education. There was a bill a couple of years ago that passed that removed anti-homosexuality language out of the state's sex ed curriculum, which was a victory, that it no longer included language that said that homosexuality is illegal and immoral behavior. I think there may be an opportunity to play some offense there and craft some legislation that does things like teach consent as part of the sex ed standards. I would think that that would be nonpartisan and non-controversial. And the Republicans have said publicly, and you'll see this in the news articles if you Google search it, that they are intending to expand access to adoptions, because they think that we're going to see in a world where abortion is criminalized, that maybe there will be more interest in adoptions. I think you will see these other issues begin to seep in around the edges. So don't just tune out to the coming legislative session and assume that it's a done deal. There's going to be opportunities to get involved, to let your lawmakers know how you feel, and look forward to working with all of y'all and answering any questions y'all may have. So thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you so much, Adrienne and Tish. We really appreciate y'all sharing your expertise. There's been a number of questions already submitted, and I guess I would just start on the first ones submitted on chat, but if anyone else has additional questions, just continue to post them on chat. I know Adrienne and Tish have already answered a couple questions, so I really do appreciate y'all doing that at the same time as sharing all of your expertise. Tabitha Ishner wanted to ask specifically, I think, to Adrienne about how the freedom to speak about what's available in other states and how that would interact with the Alabama law, and specifically the Attorney General's interpretation of that law, where we can't help other women seeking an abortion.
Yeah, this is an incredibly complex question, but first of all, I just want to say the questions in the chat are amazing. They're so on point to the issues that we're talking about, and the confusion that arises as a result of these laws, which you may seems that that's the point on a lot of these, right? To have this sweeping ban and then make all of these nuanced questions. We're afraid to ask them. We're now thinking about things like, do I have a right to talk about this? Can I talk to my doctor about this? You have to remember that we do have constitutional rights to free speech. And we do have rights that guarantee our ability to talk to one another about things like that. So yes, there have been threats from the Alabama Attorney General. I just pulled up that article someone referenced a little while ago about the aiding and abetting aspect of it. I think it's in the chat box as well. And yes, those threats are going to come out, but I do want to talk to you guys just a little bit about the different kind of tiers of cases that are going to come. As Stephen mentioned, motivated, politically savvy prosecutors are going to try and bring cases, but the cases that they're going to bring are likely going to be the most egregious cases that they can find, because they also don't want to lose, even if they, are willing to bet something just to get their name out there. And so in terms of tiers, it does seem that speaking to somebody about, a care that is available in other states would be a lower tier for prosecution. Also, I think we have to think about the fact that If it's legal in another state, can it be illegal in your state to talk about it? If all of the acts are happening elsewhere, does Alabama really have the ability to scoop up that conduct and say it's now criminal here? All of this is to say, I don't have a clear answer for you, and I wish that I did. I really do wish that I could say, you know, nothing's going to happen. But when we're talking about things like life in prison, you have to weigh that, right? You have to weigh the actual penalty. And that is the intention of the law, quite honestly, to chill speech about it and to make it so people are confused and feel that they have no actual options.
I would add to that I have seen some remarks and conversations concerning how the co-conspirator statute or the aiding and abetting statute could be applied to someone supporting or assisting a pregnant person to cross state lines if that person could not themselves commit the crime here in Alabama. And I think that is a statement made with an extraordinary lack of awareness about what desperate people do under desperate circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
This statute presumes that the only person who is going to seek perform an abortion is a medical professional or medical support. And very simply, abortions don't stop just because they're illegal, they just become unsafe. The people who are performing them are not medical professionals. They are concerned people. They are pregnant people who no longer want to be pregnant. And although the statute says X, if the person whose hand is seeking to end the pregnancy is not a medical professional, they are still criminally exposed.
Right.
The Attorney General likes that confusion. The Attorney General wants that confusion because it maintains the status quo. It maintains that people are not going to do anything to move forward to terminate their pregnancy unless they're funding, the resources, the connections to be assured that they won't be prosecuted.
Which most people are not going to have. They're not going to have. A prosecution, representing yourself and defending yourself in a criminal prosecution is incredibly expensive. Your life is on the line, and it wreaks havoc on your family and your personal life, right? You can't go through something like that. And that's why we keep having this issue. Nobody wants to be a test case, we keep saying. Tish and I were talking about this on an earlier conversation, that nobody wants to be the person that says, okay, I'm going to go out and do this, or I'm going to test the law and see what's going to happen, because the consequences are too grave.
And I also think that's part of the reason that it's 10 to 99 years instead of 10 to life, because they want you to know you're going to die if we send you to prison for breaching this law.
Well, thank you for that well-spoken, but disappointing answer. Very disappointing answer. I have a question from Laura discussing or she's asking about the Alabama constitutional amendment, and specifically if any law were passed in Alabama in whatever situation, even one that allowed rape or incest to be exceptions or just allowed abortion, would it actually help anything, since we do have the Alabama constitutional amendment giving the unborn more rights than the pregnant woman?
I can't speak to that issue specifically. I did read the chat questions and I've read a little bit about it online. I just don't think I'm as up to date on it. But I do want to just reference this one issue of that Tish mentioned earlier about weighing the life of the child against the life of the mother. I've been giving great thought to why these laws don't allow for prosecution of the mother. And I think that's it. Because if you were allowed to prosecute the mother, you would then effectively be comparing the life of the unborn to the life of the mother in very, very certain terms. And that's untenable. Nobody would allow us to go to that extreme state, I think, because it's so obvious. yet that is what we're doing. It's just that we're not saying we're going to put a woman in prison for the rest of her life for having an abortion. We've taken that out of the law so that we don't actually have to see that real, direct, exact comparison. Just my 2 cents on that.
Thank you.
I would say that our constitutional amendment was drawn up by people who have never had to sit through a property class, who have never had to learn the rule against perpetuity. And it has an impact in the law that ripples in a way that is just unworkable and unsupportable. I don't know that people have thought about how that law will apply outside of the abortion context, but it is a legal nightmare. And as soon as family lawyers figure out a way to exploit it, I strongly suspect that we will see a reversal as to the amendment. Aside from that, that amendment raises the question once more for me. Why is our Attorney General not counseling the legislature about the impact of what they are doing beyond the precise question that they are seeking to answer? Because that amendment is just one example of lay people with a great idea, so they think, moving without an understanding of the legal impact. And Alabama paying for that misstep. Aside from abortion, they will misstep.
And Stephen, do you
I want to tag on a 15-second amendment. I co-sign everything said, but y'all should remember that these laws, including the constitutional amendment, were passed in a world where they were assuming that Roe would have prevented this from going into action in the first place. So it's a little bit like the dog that caught the car. They thought this was political theater where they could say, yeah, if it wasn't for that darn federal government, all this stuff would be taken care of. So now the curtain goes up, Roe and Casey are repealed, and suddenly they're dealing with the consequences of their actions. So to echo what Tish is saying, they never thought this was going to be the law in the first place.
That's a good point. And along those same lines and a different conversation, there are 10 amendments or 11 amendments on this year's ballot. So if you weren't aware of that amendment when it came a couple of years ago or 4 or 5 years ago, do pay attention to the upcoming ballot in our current constitutional amendments. Catherine asked if the threat to the life of the mother could include the threats of suicide or self-harm, or if that's something that we just don't know yet.
I believe it's specifically accepted. I'd have to go back. It's in a separate section of the statute, but I believe it's specifically as not a reason to consider yourself saving the life of the mother. We can't consider self-harm or suicide. I know that's the law in many states specifically drafted into the actual law, but I think in Alabama it's a separate section.
I would also add here that what I am hearing from the doctors, not just OBs, but podiatrists, dentists, whoever may be in the medical field, the concern here is that the medical professional who's considering this law is weighing that against their licensing, their career,
their life,
the thing they've invested in, their life.
Mm-hmm.
And at $300,000 and $400,000 a pop, it is better to err on the side of protection. Mm-hmm. And that is where we are.
Yeah, I will say we are seeing that a lot of OBGYNs asking this question of, when does this get to the point of saving the life of the mother? Well, many states also have a provision against the corporate practice of medicine, which means that an entity can't tell the doctor what medical decisions to make. The doctor has to make those decisions. But now these physicians are placed in a position where it's my life or the patient's life. How can that possibly be a fair, discussion and a fair decision, really? Because they're thinking about the consequences on themselves. They have to be in that situation because of the way the laws are drafted. I also just wanted to point out real quickly too, I did have an OBGYN ask me recently, what other area of medicine or what other act can a physician do that is criminalized in this way? Like that it is just their medical judgment that is now being criminalized. I really couldn't think of anything. When I went through all the other criminal statutes that we have that deal with healthcare, they all have an exception that's like, doing this medical service outside the normal course of medical practice, right? It takes it away from being a medical procedure, but not in this situation. I mean, you're asking a physician to make a medical decision, and if they get it wrong, according to some legislators, then they face life in prison. We've just really never seen something like that before.
Margaret, it occurs to me, and I'm wondering if there's anybody among our audience who knows, is it also a criminal act for the med school to teach its curriculum the procedure for how to form an abortion? And if the medical school can't provide that education, is it even worth it for someone to go to med school in Alabama because they're getting an incomplete education and they're not going to be able to get licensed anyplace except Alabama? That just occurred to me, and I'm wondering how we're going to deal with that in a state that's got a shortage of doctors.
I think that is a question that residents and OBGYN instructors are facing. It's a very serious question because you have to receive that abortion care, that reproductive care, in order to even provide it in circumstances where it would be legal in Alabama, right? But how can you train on that unless you're actually faced with an exception that would fit under the statute, which is, again, highly unlikely, and you got the life in prison hanging over your head. So what we're seeing is these medical institutions saying we may have to send our patients to non-restrictive states in order to receive this care. And if that happens, and then they have to get licensed in Alabama and list out all of the different procedures that they perform, which is a requirement in many states, would they then seek some sort of criminal action as a result of that? And so are we going to be faced, or will you all be faced with a situation where you have OBGYNs who don't know how to provide this care, and then say there is a circumstance where it is absolutely necessary to save the life of the mother and there's no one to do it?
That's a big fear. We do have one of our panelists actually answered your question, Tish, and he says that it is not illegal to teach it under the current law. For what that's worth. Adrienne, to follow up on your comments, were you stating earlier that a provider such as a hospital or any other type of provider cannot provide a pre-established list of these are the circumstances that we do consider follows the laws, and you can provide an abortion without any problem?
I think that hospitals are hesitant to do that. I'm not sure. I haven't seen in my practical experience anyone doing that so far. I've seen them consulting lawyers, but in many issues, the corporate practice of medicine prohibits somebody other than the physician basically from making those medical decisions based on the law in each state. And I will say in Texas, our author of our abortion ban sent a letter to the Texas Medical Board asking for the Texas Medical Board to prosecute hospitals for the corporate practice of medicine because abortions were not being performed in circumstances where it would save the life of the mother. And that was not the intention of the law. Well, you can certainly understand how they arrived at that scenario where nobody wants to perform this service. But now the person who actually authored the law is saying, that's not what I meant, essentially.
We have a similar issue here where the author of our law is saying that, yeah, she wanted to include exceptions, but she did not at the time because Roe existed. But that's crazy. So would you be able to share with us the practical steps of a practitioner having a pregnant person in front of him or her that possibly does fall into the in one of the exceptions to allow an abortion, would they call up their attorney on speed dial before they act?
Yeah, this is the question we're getting all the time. I mean, every day we're getting this question about what does an actual physician do in that circumstance? Age is an emergency situation where time is of the essence, right? Something has got to be done right away. In some circumstances, based on some of the things we've seen in the news, we're seeing physicians saying, you know, you're not quite there yet, essentially, in their medical judgment, whatever's happening is not rise to the level of a medical emergency under the law. And then in other circumstances, we've seen like that letter that went to the Texas Medical Board, it did list out a long list of things that could be considered medical emergencies. But that's tricky because when you look at the criminal laws and what could be a defense for you, a statement by a legislator is not going to be a viable defense for you. So you couldn't say, well, the author of this law wrote this letter and he listed out these things, and I thought I was following the law. It's just not going to be a viable defense. So I think what we're seeing requests for physicians to document their file very, very thoroughly, and also to obtain a second opinion where they can. And that's what I was saying about the Alabama law requires that second opinion, and also does not allow for prosecution of that person. Which, you know, if you get a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth, that's probably the thing to do, because you've got to make sure that the file's documented and that your medical decision making, you know, is easy to understand, and you've got a defense built in.
Wow. Thank you for that answer. I'm trying to make sure that I'm not forgetting questions, but if anybody does have any other questions, please post them on the chat.
Margaret, I see this question from Lindsay asking if we can expect clarification from the AG. I know that there are a group of public interest organizations that have been working on a list of very specific questions for the AG, just seeking clarification and guidance. I do not know when we can expect that letter to go out, but I think the thought was that by now we would have some clarity on some of these questions. And the last that I heard from the AG publicly would have been earlier this week. And it seemed that he was threatening prosecutions, not clarifying the circumstances under which he would or would not.
I was just going to point to something too. This just made me think when Stephen was mentioning, you know, races that might be more, you know, more up in the air than we previously thought. You know, this is probably the first time that many people are thinking about what do they want in their local district attorney. I mean, we often think about our attorney general, we think about our governor, but most people aren't thinking on a local level like that. What do you want in your attorney general? I mean, in your district attorney, because those are the people that are going to be on the front lines of prosecuting this, making those actual decisions. So as I was mentioning earlier, with some who've come out with statements, some who haven't, that's a good area just to do further research and see if that lines up with your values.
Thank you. That makes sense. We do have a continued question as far as nationally, would passing the ERA make all of these problems go away?
I don't know the answer to that. I think what we need is a constitutional amendment for sure to guarantee a right to privacy or a right to specifically abortion. I feel like we're at a point in our history where so much has happened with the Dobbs decision, and so much has been kind of cut down that the only way to get back to a federal right is going to be through a constitutional amendment. I mean, that's just me thinking out loud. I think what we're trying to do now, and maybe it is positive in some respects, that voters have more control over their local elections and their local government to be able to, you know, move the needle forward in the direction that they want to see. Federally, I just think it's going to be a real uphill battle.
Thank you for that opinion.
Yeah, I'll just tag in on that and just say, I would encourage some people, as we think about that national big picture framework. I mean, to me, I get excited about a local DA's race because you know who to volunteer for and go out and make it happen. It's your town. You can make this happen. And if we can create an atmosphere where there's less criminalization and prosecutions, that's great. It gets a little stickier when you talk about the large half-century war on substantive due process that has been fought by the Federalist Society for a full generation now, that has ripped all of these sort of underpinnings of Roe and Casey out of the Constitution. So that's harder to get a grasp on. But I will say, I just read a really interesting article on the federal constitutional landscape that would say that if they're right, there is still no, if the war on substantive due process is correct, that efforts like Lindsey Graham's effort to create a federal ban would also be similarly faulty. So it may still be a state-by-state battle, but when we talk about changing the constitutional landscape, there's a question of whether you amend the Constitution and change the terms of the debate, or hold them accountable for the judiciary they've already created, which says these are all state issues, and then you have a state-by-state fight to push us more towards Massachusetts or whatever else it might be. So a lot of interesting sort of law school questions there.
And there's a new question posted along those lines as far as travel to other states, is simply providing financial support to organizations such as Planned Parenthood in another state that does provide abortions. Does that constitute aiding and abetting?
I think it's certainly a difference of opinions, because I do stand by what I said earlier, which is I think that providing support to a service that is legal in another state, I think that's going to be a real uphill battle for somebody to prosecute that as aiding and abetting, because the conduct is not illegal in the state where it's occurring. And I would just go back to this question specifically on Planned Parenthood. You know, Planned Parenthood does a lot of things other than provide abortion care. So I think that would be a hard argument to make, that you're supporting, you know, that you're intending your funds to go directly towards abortion care in a state where it's illegal, when you know that that's not possible. It's not possible for Planned Parenthood right now to provide abortions in Alabama. As far as travel assistance, again, I just think, you know, in Texas, we had a legislator come out and say that, yes, Brett Kavanaugh said there's a constitutional right to interstate travel, but there's not a right to pay for interstate travel or to have your interstate travel paid for. I think that's grandstanding. And I looked at, in Alabama, you could do this too. And what I did for Texas is I looked at our jurisdictional tie-ins. So like, what area can Texas actually prosecute? What parts of a crime have to happen in Texas for Texas to be able to prosecute? And Alabama has jurisdictional statutes, I'm sure. And when you look at those, some will say things along the lines of like, well, if part of the abortion happens in the state, then you know, the state can prosecute on that. And I think that would be such circumstances such as an abortion medication, where you take one pill outside the state, say you take the second pill inside the state. Now Alabama has a tie around that. But if all of the acts happen entirely outside the state, I think that's a real uphill battle.
Well, we have one positive from the entire presentation, so I appreciate that. Do you think that that people should be cautious of what they're posting on social media as far as giving information about abortion availability in other states, or even providing financial assistance?
I'm going to let Tish answer that one. I'm sure she has an opinion on that.
I personally do not provide information about abortion funds, abortion service providers, flights, or anything of that nature on my social media. I generally discourage people from discussing anything associated with their reproductive system on social media. We already know that some social media sites, if subpoenaed for information, will provide it with no fight whatsoever. And I have altered the app that I use to track my menstrual cycle. I have altered the way that I message on it. And this Attorney General, irrespective of what your local DA has said that he has the authority to seek a prosecution anywhere in the state of Alabama. Those are my precautions. Everyone has to make a decision based on what they love and what they fear. And this is a time that I never thought I would see in my generation. I am almost 50 years old. I have never known a world in which a person who becomes pregnant has no option, no privacy. And like many people my age, I don't know what to do. And I don't know what to tell people. I turned to the women a generation and asked, how did y'all manage this before Roe versus Wade? Because that is what we are back to. We just have more ways to broadcast that something has happened and that we are acting in our own best interest concerning it. And that scares me to death. That's a terrible non-answer, isn't it?
It is a direct answer, and I appreciate it. Sharing what you personally are doing is more powerful than anything we could have hoped for. I appreciate that. I understand that we are at a loss of time now. You've given so much to our state and our citizens, and I really appreciate every single one of you being willing to answer the questions as well as share all of your knowledge. I understand that the Alabama League of Women Voters has a blog post, and they are going to share that now regarding just the problems and the issues of reproductive care and the reproductive laws. It's truly a miracle when everything goes right in a pregnancy. So now everybody knows the special circumstances that can occur and do occur every day. So thank you for letting us be just more understanding of what's going on here today.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was really great to have the opportunity to speak to you all and to speak with Stephen and Tish. It was really fantastic. Thank you.
This has been, thank you. I wanted to step in for just a minute and make a few announcements before we end, because you guys made me realize we would be absolutely remiss. Well, first of all, thank you all for participating. And I want to thank the panelists and the moderator. This has been a very powerful discussion. And it gives us a lot of food for thought and frankly, terrifying reality for Alabama. But it points out once again, midterm elections matter. Don't let anybody tell you that they're only vote in presidential elections. Who you're electing at the state and local levels matters, impacts your lives, probably more so than a lot of the people up in Washington, D.C. And what you've heard tonight just illustrates that absolutely in spades, because you have a choice on who represents you. You can go out and actually work for the election, for the campaigns. You can go out and make a difference in your community, and you need to do that. And you need to get out there and make sure you're registered to vote. I wanted to say that October 24th is the deadline for registering to vote for the November 8th midterm. And November 8th is not that far away. So make sure that you have a way to get to the polls. Call your family and friends. Don't forget your disabled family and friends, because more than likely they need help getting to the polls, especially. And so we need to help each other get to the polls. And we also need to make sure everybody's got a plan to vote. And this type of situation here, we need to find a way to make a difference. And also, like Stephen said, or maybe it was several of you said, is call your legislators and talk to them. Make sure they know you're not happy. And Tish, you had.
Kathy, I just want to remind everyone that I believe you can now send in the request for your absentee ballot if you qualify The qualifications include that you will be traveling during the election, that you are working and unable to get released, or if there are any other circumstances that would prevent or prohibit you from presenting to the polls. There will also be a training for people who are interested in voter protection and 866 Our Vote. That training will be in Montgomery next week, Thursday. There will also be a training October 13th in Mobile. And get out there, vote, take someone with you. If someone wants help and asks for it, please provide it. This is a critical moment for us.
Yeah, it definitely. And I was going to tell you, we've actually gotten the Legal Defense Fund is going to provide training for us on the 28th, next September 28th, because we would like to have as many people. If you're not a poll worker, we want people to be poll workers. But if you're not a poll worker, then you need to be a poll monitor, which means going out there and basically going to the polling places, making sure there's not voter suppression going on at the polling places, as well as doing taking photographs and image it, basically measuring and making sure polling places are accessible. But Tish, that's what you're talking about, because we would be working with the Election Protection Network, 1-866 Our Vote, which, by the way,
Right.
The Secretary of State office does not have that phone number anywhere on their website. So that's a problem.
I provide his number in all of my trainings. So his number is hard to remember. 866 Our Vote is easy.
I have his cell phone number. He puts his cell phone number and he'll answer it if you want to call Secretary of State Merrill, but it won't help if you've got a problem, because you need to call Election Protection Network.
That's it.
I did want to also just mention to everybody, I needed to put a shout out for our next week. We're also having, in addition to future reproductive health forums that are being planned by our advocacy team, we are going to have a forum next week on the wilderness, because there are so many topics that matter to Alabamians that, it's hard to, we're basically trying to hit a lot of different topics so people understand how elected officials can impact your life and the environment of Alabama. And that's so important. All of this we need to understand better. So Jean is dropping links to the registration in the chat. And if you want to register, we'll send out, if you get on our newsletter, we'll send out regular reminders for the forums. So if you're on our list, we'll send you a reminder. And I guess that is all I had. And I want to say thank you again. This has been a powerful discussion, and I appreciate you all joining us tonight.
Kathy, would you like to mention the Secretary of State forum?
Oh, yes, I do. Thank you for reminding me, Jean.
Sure.
One more forum we're having on October the 11th. We are having the Secretary of State candidate forum on, it's a Zoom forum. And we're going to have 2 of the 3 candidates have agreed to join us for a forum. And those, we will look forward to that. That's a follow-on to the candidate forum we had for the GOP primary back in April. So now we're having the primary, the general election Secretary of State forum, because that office is absolutely critical to protecting voting rights and safe elections for all of us. So hope you'll join us for that as well. And Jean dropped that in the chat as well. So thank you, everybody. Look forward to future meetings, and have a good evening.